welcome to Criminalist Behavior Podcast. I want to welcome you to our podcast, and this is a podcast that takes you deep into the heart of Louisiana's history and current most chilling true crime stories. I'm your host, and I'll be guiding you through the darkest of these crimes and those involved. Each week, we dig deep for those forgotten crimes or those crimes that may just be currently happening with the underlying legends that continue to haunt us. So lean in, listen, and get ready because true crime is anything but ordinary. Stay with me as we unravel what happened in these mysteries. So today we're going to be on episode number 19, and we're going to be taking you back to 1834. A New Orleans socialite and serial killer who was believed to have tortured and murdered slaves in her house. If this is your first time listening, hi, my name is Sarah Soudier, and I'm your host for Criminalist Behavior Podcast. I want to thank you for listening to the show, and I hope you enjoy it. So, trigger warning, this episode may contain content of a graphic nature, including descriptions of physical abuse against adults, children, and animals. Listener discretion is advised. Y'all, we're going to be talking about Louisiana's first female serial killer, Marie Delphine. She was known as Marie Delphine Macarty or MacCarthy, different spellings. She was born on March 19th in the year 1787. More commonly, she was known as Madame Blanque, or after her third marriage as Madame LaLaurie, was a New Orleans socialite and obviously a serial killer who was believed to have tortured and murdered slaves in her house. A socialite, for those of y'all who may not know, is a person who is usually from a wealthy or aristocratic background who was prominent in high society. They generally spend a significant amount of time attending various fashionable social gatherings instead of having a traditional 9-to-5 job or any hard labor job. So, following Robert Cavalier de Sales, he established French claim to the territory and to the introduction of the name Louisiana. The first settlements in the southernmost portion of Louisiana, which was known as New France, was developed as present-day Biloxi in 1699. Mobile in 1702, Natchitoches in 1714, and New Orleans in 1718. Just to give you a little background on the times here. Slavery was then established by European colonists. The institution, Lord, I'm going to speak right, y'all. I'm going to get it. The institution was maintained by Spanish from 1763 to the 1800s. When that area was part of New Spain by the French, and it was reacquired by the colony in between 1800 and 1803, and by the United States following the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. And due to its complex history, Louisiana had a very different pattern of slavery compared to the rest of the United States. Slavery was introduced by French colonists in Louisiana in 1706 when they made raids on Chitimacha settlements. Thousands of indigenous people were killed, and surviving women and children were taken in as slaves. The enslavement of natives, including the, forgive me if I mispronounce this, Atakapa, Biogola, Natchez, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Tennessee, Alabama peoples would continue. Y'all, that was hard for me. Don't laugh. I am trying. Throughout the history of the French rule. While Native American people had sometimes made slaves of enemies captured in war, they also tended to adopt them into their tribes and incorporate them among their people. Born during Spanish colonial period, LaLaurie married 3 times in Louisiana and was twice widowed. She maintained her position in New Orleans society until April 10th, 1834, when rescuers responded to a fire at her Royal Street mansion. They discovered bound slaves in her attic who showed evidence of cruel violence abused over a long period. LaLaurie's house was subsequently sacked by an outraged mob of New Orleans citizens. She escaped to France with her family. The mansion, traditionally held to be LaLaurie's, is a landmark in the French Quarter, in part because of its history and for its architectural significance. However, her house was burned by the mob, and the LaLaurie Mansion at 1140 Royal Street was in fact rebuilt after she left New Orleans to go to France. So, Madame Delphine Macarty was born in New Orleans, Spanish Louisiana, on March 19, 1787, as one of 5 children. Her father was Louis Barthélemy de Macarty, originally Chevalier de Macarty, whose father, Barthélemy de Macarty, moved the family to New Orleans from Ireland around 1730 during the French colonial period. The Irish surname MacCarthy was shortened to MacCarthy or de Macarty. Her mother was Marie Jean Larrabal, also known as the widow Lecomte, as her marriage to Louis B. Macarty was her second. Both of Delphine's parents were prominent in the city's European Creole community. Her uncle by marriage, Esteban Rodriguez Miro, was governor of the Spanish-American provinces of Louisiana and Florida during 1785 through 1791. And her cousin, Augustin de Macarty, was mayor of New Orleans from 1815 to 1820. So that's why I gave you a little history. So Delphine was only 4 years of age when Haitian Revolution erupted in 1791, something that made slaveholders in southern United States and the Caribbean very afraid of resistance and rebellion among slaves. Delphine's uncle had been killed in 1771 by his slaves, and the revolution had inspired the local Mina conspiracy in 1791. So, in case y'all didn't know what the Mina conspiracy was, the Mina were a community of well-organized, enslaved black people in Louisiana who spoke a common language. Most of their dialect was of Ewe, which may have been related to the Fon people. The Pointe Coupé conspiracy in 1794 was also part of this, and this was on June 25th, 1791. A group of enslaved Mina gathered on estate of the widowed Robillard in New Roads, Pointe Coupé Parish. Jean-Louis, who was enslaved there, organized regular balls from Mina men. During a gathering, the plan was made for the Mina to rise up and free themselves, gathering pickaxes, knives, and other weapons to mount an attack on a storekeeper who could be raided for guns, gunpowder, shot, and other weapons. The only 2 non-Mina people involved were Caesar from Jamaica, ethnically, and Ashanti, and Pedro Chamba was ethnically Chamba but had been raised by the Mina. And in 1811, the German Coast Uprising happened, and this was a revolt of slaves in parts of the territory of Orleans on January 8th through the 10th in 1811. The uprising occurred on the east bank of the Mississippi River in what is now St. John the Baptist, St. Charles, and Jefferson parishes, Louisiana. The slave insurgency was the largest in United States history, but the rebels killed only 2 white men. Confrontations with the militia, combined with post-trial executions, resulted in the death of 95 slaves. Between 64 and 125 enslaved men marched from sugarcane plantations in the near present-day La Place on the German coast towards the city of New Orleans. They collected more men along the way. Some accounts claimed a total of 200 to 500 enslaved people participated. During their 2-day, 20-mile-long march, the men burned 5 plantation houses, 3 completely, several sugar houses, which a sugar house is a building where sugar is made or refined, so just like its name, and crops. They were mostly armed with hand tools, all of which many slaveholders to abuse slaves even more harshly out of fear of insurrection, which insurrection is an armed rebellion. So Marie Delphine's first marriage happened on June 11, 1800. She was only 13 years old, and she married Don Ramon de Lopez y Angulo, a caballero de la Rio de Carlos. I'm trying, y'all. A high-ranking Spanish royal officer at the St. Louis Cathedral in New Orleans. Louisiana, as it was spelled in Spanish, had become a Spanish colony in the 1760s, and after France was defeated in the 7 Years' War. In 1804, after the American acquisition, aka the Louisiana Purchase, was created, they consisted most of the land of the Mississippi River's drainage basin west of the river. In return for $15 million, or approximately $18 per square mile, the United States acquired a total of 828,000 square miles in Middle America of what was then, again, a French territory. Don Ramon had been appointed to the position of Consul General, and at that time, a Consul General was an official representative of a government who resided in a foreign country to assist and protect citizens of the consul's country, and to promote and facilitate commercial and diplomatic relations between the two countries. Generally, part of a government's diplomatic corps or foreign service enjoys certain privileges and protections in its hostess state, and this was without full diplomatic immunity. For Spain in territory New Orleans, and was called to appear at the royal court in Madrid. While en route with Delphine, who was then pregnant, Don Ramon suddenly died in Havana. A few days after his death, Delphine gave birth to his daughter, Marie Borja Bordilla Delphine Lopez y Anglo de la Candelaria, nicknamed Borquita. The widowed Delphine and her child then returned to New Orleans. So then it came her second marriage, which happened in June of 1808. She was about 21 years old, and she married Jean Blanque, a prominent banker, merchant, lawyer, and legislator. At the time of the marriage, Blanque purchased a house on 409 Royal Street for the family, which became known as the Villa Blanque. Delphine had 4 children by Blanque, named Marie-Louise Pauline, Louise Marie-Laure, Marie-Louise Jean, and Jean-Pierre Pauline Blanque. The elder, Jean Blanque, died in 1816. Now we move on to her third marriage. Her third marriage happened on June 25th, 1825. Delphine married her third husband, and he was a physician. His name was Leonard Louis Nicholas LaLaurie, who was 15 years her junior. In the year of 1831, she bought property at 1140 Royal Street, which she managed in her own name with little involvement of her husband. In 1832, she had a 2-story mansion built there, completely with attached slave quarters. And slave quarters, or just like it sounds, the homes of the enslaved people attached to American plantation farm or city property. And some former slave quarters were continuously occupied and used as personal residencies into the late 1960s. Y'all, that's crazy that they had slaves that long. Slaves, period, but weaker people of the time. So, LaLaurie lived at the residence with her third husband and 2 of her daughters, and maintained a central position in New Orleans society. The marriage soon showed signs of strain. So, on November 16, 1832, Delphine petitioned the First Judicial District Court for a separation from bed and board of her husband, in which Delphine claimed that LaLaurie had treated her in such a manner as to render their living together insupportable, claims which her son and 2 of her daughters by Jean Blanque was confirmed. The separation does not seem to have been permanent, as Dr. LaLaurie was present at the Royal Street house on April 10th, 1834, which was the day of the fire. So now we're going to get to that event, the day of the fire. It happened in 1834, and it was the torture and murder of slaves. Accounts of Delphine's treatments of her slave between 1831 and 1834 vary. Harriet Martineau was an English social theorist. She wrote from a sociological, holistic, religious, and feminine angle. She's translated works by Augustine Comte, and rarely for a woman writer at this time, earned enough to support herself. The young Princess Victoria enjoyed her work and invited her to the 1838 coronation, so she made it up there to go to the princess's coronation. Martineau advised a focus on all society's aspects, including key political, religious, and social institutions. She applied through analysis to women's status under men. Novelist Margaret O'Fillon called her a born lecturer and politician, less distinctively affected by her sex than perhaps other male or female of her generation. Recounting tales told by her by New Orleans residents during her 1836 visit, she claimed that slaves of LaLaurie were observed to be singularly haggard and wretched when compared to other enslaved individuals. However, at least in public appearances, LaLaurie was seen to be generally polite to black people and solicitous of health of those she enslaved. Funeral registers between 1830 and 1834 document the death of 12 slaves at the Royal Street Mansion. Although the causes of said death are not mentioned, infectious diseases could easily have been the cause. These deaths included a woman named Blanque, 1803 to February 7, 1833, a cook and laundress and her 4 children. Juliet, 1820 to 1833, died at age 13. Florence, 1821 to 1831, died at age 10. Jules died at age 6. And the youngest, Leontine, died at age 4. 4, 6, and 8 and 13. Really? These are children. Children. I don't even want to know what this woman did. Bone had previously been enslaved by a refugee from Saint Dominique and was described during her sale. And a sale of slaves, just in case you didn't know, is part of a slave market where slaves are bought and sold. As a chronic runaway with an influx of white and free Saint Dominican refugees of color and those whom they have enslaved, the fear of slaves from Saint Dominique still lingered in Louisiana. Court records at the time show that LaLaurie freed 2 slaves, Jean-Louis in 1819 and Da Vinci in 1832. Martineau wrote that public rumors about her mistreatment of slaves at the Royal Street residence were significantly widespread, so much so that a local lawyer was dispatched to the property to remind LaLaurie of the laws for the upkeep of slaves. During this visit, the lawyer found no evidence to suggest wrongdoing or mistreatment of slaves by LaLaurie. Martineau also recounted other tales by LaLaurie's cruelty that were whispered amongst New Orleans residences around 1836, saying that subsequent to the visit of the lawyer, one of the LaLaurie's neighbors saw an 8-year-old slave girl fall to her death from the roof of the mansion while trying to avoid punishment from a whip-wielding LaLaurie. This little girl, 8 years old, on the roof, fell to her death trying to get away from LaLaurie from whipping her with a whip. The girl's body was subsequently buried on the mansion grounds. Jean de Levin, in her 1945 account, gave the child's age as 12 years old and named her as Leah. Later, writers elaborated on the case, saying that Leah had been brushing Delphine's hair when she hit a snag, causing LaLaurie to grab a whip in anger and chase her. This woman made these slaves brush her hair, and then whenever, I guess, they got to a knot and it hurt her, she would whip them. No. You're lazy, bro. And just, no. According to Martineau, the incident led to an investigation of the LaLauries in which they were found guilty of illegal cruelty and forced to forfeit 9 slaves of the household. These 9 enslaved people were then brought back to the LaLauries through an intermediary relative and thus returned to the mansion. So they got away, but then they were bought from a relative and returned back to the mansion. Martineau recounted stories that LaLaurie kept her cook starved and chained to the kitchen stove, beating her daughters when they attempted to feed themselves or others. Yeah, you heard that right. LaLaurie chained her cook to the stove, and beat her children for trying to eat and feed others. On April 10th, 1834, is when a fire broke out in the LaLaurie Mansion, and it began in the kitchen. When police and fire marshals reached the residence, they found a 70-year-old cook chained to the stove by her ankle. The cook later said that she had set the fire as a suicide attempt because she feared being punished, stating that slaves taken to the uppermost room never came back. As reported in New Orleans Bee, which was a newspaper in New Orleans, founded September 1st, 1827 by François de Lappe, and originally located at 94 St. Peter Street between Royal and Bourbon. On April 11, 1834, bystanders responded to the fire, attempted to enter the quarters of those enslaved to ensure that everyone had been evacuated. And upon being refused the keys by the LaLauries, the bystanders broke down the doors to the quarters and found 7 slaves, more or less horribly mutilated, suspended by the neck with their limbs apparently stretched and torn from one extremity to the other, who claimed to have been imprisoned there for some months in the attic. One of those who entered the premises was Judge Jean-Francois Cagnot, who subsequently disposed to having found in the LaLaurie Mansion, among others, a negress wearing an iron collar and an old, and I don't like saying these words, but this is what was stated by Judge Jean-Francois. An old Negro woman who had received a very deep wound on her head, who was too weak to be able to walk. Judge Jean-Francois said that when he questioned Lottie's husband about those enslaved on the property, he was told in an insolent manner that some people had better stay at the home rather than come to others' houses to dictate laws and meddle with other people's businesses. A version of this story circulating in 1836 and recounted by Martineau added that the slaves were emaciated, which defined the state of extreme thinness and the absence of body fat and muscle wasting, usually resulting from malnutrition. They also showed signs of being flayed, a method of slow and painful execution in which skin is removed from the body. Generally, an attempt is made to keep the removed portion of the skin intact. So she was skinning these people alive with a whip, were bound to restrictive postures. She posed them and bounded them in those positions. And they wore spiked collars, which kept their heads in static positions. So, yeah, she was that strict. Had spike collar around their neck. So if they leaned their head a certain way, they would get stabbed by the spikes. Such a cruel, cruel woman. Oh my God. That's just devastating. When the discovery of the abused slaves became widely known, a mob of local citizens attacked the LaLaurie Mansion and demolished and destroyed everything upon which they could lay their hands. A sheriff and his officers were called to disperse the crowd, but by the time the mob left, the property had sustained major damage, with scarcely anything remaining but the walls. The slaves were taken to a local jail, where they were available for public viewing. The Bee reported that by April 12, up to 4,000 people had attended to view the slaves to convince themselves of their sufferings. The Pittsville Sun, citing the New Orleans Advertiser, and several weeks after the evacuation of Lottie's quarters of slaves, claimed that 2 of the slaves found in the mansion had died following their rescue. It added, "We understand that in digging the yard, bodies have been disinterred, and the condemned well in the grounds of the mansion have been uncovered. Others, particularly that of a child, were found." These claims were repeated by Martineau in her 1838 book, Retrospective Western Travel, where she placed a number of unearthed bodies at 2, including the aforementioned child, Leah. Escaped from justice and self-imposed exile in France, Lottie's life after the 1834 fire is not well documented. Martineau wrote in 1838 that she fled New Orleans during the mob violence that followed the fire, taking a coach to the waterfront, and then she traveled by schooner, which is a type of sailing vessel defined by its rig, fore and aft rigged on all 2 or more masts, and in the case of 2-masted schooner, The foremast generally is shorter than the main mast. And she went to Mobile, Alabama, and then to Paris. By the time Martineau personally visited the Royal Street Mansion in 1836, it was still unoccupied and badly damaged, with gaping windows and empty walls. So later life and death, while Delphine was living in exile in Paris with her mother and two sisters, Pauline and Laure, her son Madame Blanque, wrote August 15, 1842, to his brother-in-law, Augustus de Lassus, stating that Delphine was serious about returning to New Orleans and had thought about doing so for quite some time. He wrote in the same letter that he believed that his mother never had an idea about the reason for her departure from the city. Despite Delphine's bad mood and her determination to return, the disapproval of her children and other relatives had apparently been enough for her to cancel those plans. The circumstances of LaLaurie's death are so unclear. In 1888, George Washington Cable was an American novelist notable for the realism of his portrayals of Creole life in his native New Orleans, Louisiana, and been called the most important Southern orders working in the 19th century, recounted a popular but substantiated story that LaLaurie had died in France in a boar hunting accident. In the 1930s, Eugene Bax, who served as a sexton to St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 until 1924, which is the oldest cemetery among the most prominent cemeteries in New Orleans. It opened in 1789, and it replaced the city's older St. Peter's Cemetery as the main burial ground when the city was redesigned after a fire. Discovered an old cracked copper plate and alley for the cemetery. The inscription on this plate read, Madame LaLaurie, née Marie Delphine Macarty, décédée à la Paris, the 7 December 1842. The English translation to the inscription, yeah, because I need that. Madame LaLaurie, born Marie Delphine Macarty, died in Paris, December 7, 1842, at the age of 6. According to French archives of Paris, however, LaLaurie died on December 7th, 1849, at the age of 62. So, a little discrepancy there, so they don't really know when she died, but the French archives in Paris stated she died December 7, 1849, and that was her last known location. So, the LaLaurie Mansion, the original Royal Street Mansion, occupied by LaLaurie, obviously did not survive that fire. The mansion was located at the corner of Governor Nichols Street, formerly known as Hospital Street, and commonly referred to as the LaLaurie Haunted House, is not the same building that was inhabited by LaLaurie and the slaves. When she acquired the property in 1831 from Ed Sonnet de Fawcett, a house was already under construction and finished for LaLaurie. The house was burned by the mob in 1834 and remained in a ruined state for at least another 4 years. It was then rebuilt by Pierre Troster after 1838 and assumed the appearance that it has today. And I'm going to link that in the show notes, y'all, so y'all can see this mansion. Over the following decades, it was used as a public high school or a conservatory of music, an apartment building, a refuge for young delinquents, a bar, a furniture store, and even a luxury apartment building. The house had a third floor, and in the back of the building that was later added in the 19th century, and the rear building on the Governor Nichols Street had only one floor until a second one was added in the 20th century. It was remodeled in the 1970s when the second floor interior of the building was done over by Coach and Wilson architects. At 3 stories high, it was described in 1928 as the highest building 4 squares around. With that result from cupola, which is a relatively small, most often dome-like tall structure on top of a building. So picture a big dome on top of a building. It had one of those. This was often used to provide a lookout or to emit light and air inside the home, and it usually crowns a larger roof or dome. On the roof, one may look out over the Vauquerier, which is the known neighborhood and the oldest neighborhood of New Orleans, also known as the French Quarter, and it sees the Mississippi in a crescent before Jackson Square. So the entrance to the building bears iron grill work, and the door is carved with the image of Phoebus, also known as Apollo. And he is in a chariot with wreaths of flowers and garlands and a bas-relief, which is a projecting image with a shallow overall depth, which is used like on coins and to that nature. And in the lowest reliefs, the relative depth of the element shown is completely distorted. And if it's seen from the side, the image makes no sense. But if seen in the front, it's a three-dimensional image. So inside the doors, the floor is black and white marble. And a curved mahogany railed staircase runs full 3 stories of the building. The second floor holds 3 large drawing rooms, which, if you like me, I didn't know what a drawing room was. It's a room in a house where visitors may be entertained, an alternative name for a living room. And it was connected by ornate sliding doors, whose walls were decorated with plaster rosettes. And rosettes are derived from a natural shape, the botanical rosette, and it's formed by leaves radiating out from a stem of a plant and visible even after the flowers have wilted. It had carved woodwork, black marble mantel pieces, and fluted plasters. In April 2007, actor Nicolas Cage bought this house for a sum of $3.45 million. And to protect the actor's privacy, the mortgage documents were arranged in such a way that Cage's name did not appear on them. On November 13, 2009, the property, then valued at $3.5 million, was listed for auction as a result of the foreclosure and purchased by Regions Financial Corporation for $2.3 million. The property last changed hands in 2010 when it purchased by current owner Michael Whalen for $2.1 million. Laurie and folklore. Folk histories of Laurie's abuse and murder of those enslaved on the property circulated in Louisiana during the 19th century and were reprinted in collections of stories by Henry Castellanos and George Washington Cable. Cable's account, not to be confused with his unrelated 1881 novel Madame Delphine, was based on contemporary reports in newspapers such as the Bee and Advertiser and upon Martineau's 1838 account. Retrospect of Western travel, he added some of his own synthesis, dialogue, and speculation. After 1945, accounts of those enslaved by Laurie's became more explicit. Jean Devin, writing in Ghost Stories of the Old New Orleans in 1946, alleged that Laurie had a sadistic appetite that seemed never appeased until she had inflicted on one or more of her black servitors some hideous form of torture, and claimed that those who responded to 1834 fire had found male slaves stark naked, chained to the wall, their eyes gouged out, their fingernails pulled off by the roots. Others had joints, skin, and festering, great holes in their buttocks where the flesh had been sliced away, their ears hanging by shreds, their lips sewn together. Intestines were pulled out and knotted around naked waists. There were holes in the skulls where a rough stick had been inserted to stir the brains. Yeah, that's graphic. Delevine did not cite any sources for the claims, and they were not supported by primary sources. So that is folklore, y'all. The story was further embellished by A Journey into the Darkness, Ghosts and Vampires of New Orleans in 1998, which was written by Kalila Katharina Smith, and she was the operator of New Orleans ghost tour business. Smith's book added several more explicit details to the discoveries allegedly made by rescuers during the 1834 fire. Included a victim who obviously had her arms amputated and her skin peeled off in a circular pattern, making her look like a human caterpillar, and another who had her limbs broken and reset at odd angles so she could resemble a human crab. That's just disturbing. Many of these details in Smith's books were unsourced, while others were not supported by the sources given. Today, modern retellings of the Laurie legend often uses Delvine and Smith's versions of the tale as basis for claims of explicit tortures, and number enslaved people living on the property who died under Laurie's care, as many as 100 slaves. In popular culture, Kathy Bates portrayed a heavily fictionalized version of the character in the 3rd season of anthology television series American Horror Story. And the widespread critical acclaim earned a primetime a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Supporting Actress in a Limited or Anthology Series or Movie for her performance. In her 1999 novel, Fever Season, mystery writer Barbara Hambly incorporated the events of the 1834 fire and discovery of the brutal treatment of slaves into her narrative. In 2015 and 17, there's a serialized science fiction novel named On Song, and this was written by Scott Alexander. LaLaurie is mentioned as being in the nicest part of hell, reserved for the worst sinners, along with Hitler and Barrier. So, y'all, that is the story of Marie Delphine Macarty. And that's just brutal. This torture, I mean, given the times and all, it still doesn't excuse the fact of her just not even following the rules that he even had set forth for those who did have slaves. I am curious to see what you think of the show. What's your opinions? If you have anything to add to this, any folklore, whatever you may have known, or if you have any suggestions for any new cases, I am all open ears. You can contact me by email at criminalbehaviorpodcast@gmail.com. You can follow us on any of our local social media apps. We're out there. So if you enjoyed the show, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon, Wondery, wherever you listen to your podcasts. And be sure to come back for more content. I am going to try my darndest to at least publish 2 episodes a week, but at least one. So there will never be a week that I don't publish one. And if there is, I will make sure that y'all note it in time. So until then, this is your host, Sarah Cidier, and don't forget to like, share, comment, review, or subscribe to Criminalist Behavior, a Louisiana true crime podcast. Thank y'all and enjoy y'all day.